On today's World Insight with Tianwei, China's first international import expo in the works. How will new trade platforms and ideas provide new momentum? And in tonight's Writing China, hang on to the words of master Chinese poet Xi Chuan. Why is his approach so groundbreaking?
丰收后荒凉的大地，黑夜从你内部上升。你从远方来，我到远方去。
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The countdown has begun for the first ever China International Import Expo. Shanghai is busy preparing to host nearly 3,000 companies from around the world. China is pulling out all the stops to champion free trade and globalization despite apparent U.S. efforts to put up more trade barriers. Take a look.
The world's largest exporter trains its sights on importing. From November 5 to 10, 2,800 companies from over 130 countries are expected to be in Shanghai to showcase their products and to make deals with more than 160,000 Chinese and foreign purchasers. The China International Import Expo, announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping back in May 2017, is the first of its kind in China, a part of the country's efforts to open up more. Shanghai, which is used to hosting international events, has been holding rehearsals and training 5,000 volunteers as part of preparations. World industry leaders are expected to bring cutting-edge high-tech products, with more than 100 new products and technologies expected to debut at the Expo. New and upcoming companies look to win the hearts of Chinese consumers. While China rolls out the red carpet for the Import Expo, U.S. President Donald Trump is busy putting up more trade barriers. Under a new deal signed by the United States, Mexico and Canada, rules were tightened to limit suppliers for certain industries to be from the three North American countries. Parts of the deal were seen as a move by the U.S. to stop Canada and Mexico from signing a free trade deal with China. In the next 5 years, China is expected to import products and services worth more than $10 trillion US. Economists agree global trade has fueled growth over the past decades, and protectionism may just put a damper on that.
For more on global trade, China's first ever Import Expo, and the discussions related to the USMCA, join me in the Beijing studio, John Gong, who is a professor from the University of International Business and Economics. Also in Beijing, Einar Tangen, our current affairs commentator. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. I want to start with you, Professor Gong. Your take on the USMCA. Some say, finally, there's a deal, you know, a substitute to NAFTA earlier. Others say this is so different a version when it comes to trade deals. What do you say?
Well, first of all, I'm not very convinced that this is a much better deal than the previous NAFTA deal, even from the American perspective. I mean, I think the significance of all that is that Donald Trump can claim he had a deal, and he can claim that this is a better deal. Mm-hmm. You know, the truth of it is not known. I mean, at least not to the American people. Nobody's going to really go out and really check what is.
So what are the details that you are looking at?
Well, I think, you know, if you compare the clauses regarding the automobile industry, the deals with Canada regarding the dairy product, maybe make some progress on the dairy products. It's not a significant improvement, but I think from China's perspective, what's really significant, as we discussed in the script, is respect to this Article 32.10, and that's a really significant development. And I think I'm really surprised, I don't know if you agree with me, that Canada would acquiesce with something like this. And it looks like he's going to insist the same thing to be inserted in the agreement with Japan. I think Japan is going to do that as well.
Okay, well, that's a comprehensive answer. We have to divide some of those parts of the answer and handle them later, individually. Okay. First of all, what about that so-called car part and car component issue involved in the USMCA, Mr. Tangen?
Okay, it went from
62%, 75%.
Well, it went from 62.5% to 75%, but if you actually look at the way that they're now defining it, it's only 70%. So you're talking about 7.5% difference. This is a far cry from what Donald Trump promised everybody. He's also said that the 40 to 45% has to come from workers who are earning $16 or more a year. Now, that sounds great. It sounds great to American workers, but will it actually happen? There's a
Mainly it is the country of Mexico that deal, that part is dealing with.
Yes, but it's not that simple. I mean, there's a global supply chain. To take down a factory and take it somewhere else, to displace workers, to hire new workers, given the employment.
Some say this could happen just within a few years' time.
Oh, yes, it could happen in a few years if somebody is willing to make the investment. Remember, no one knows if this is actually going to pass. This has to be approved not only by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico legislatures. It hasn't done that. And the clause that you're talking about, this idea that countries, sovereign countries, have to disclose to the United States everything they're doing 6 months in advance of them doing it, and then show them everything. This is a very, very strange clause, and it's going to be very difficult to pass in all these legislatures.
Let's also talk about another part involved in this deal, which is about the dairy products. Certainly, it seems that the American industry is opened up a little bit the door to Canada when it comes to dairy products, but when you look at the numbers, certainly it's a very small number. Having said that, though, that could be politically significant for Mr. Trump, but the question is, what has Canada sacrificed? Has Canada been compensated in the other parts of the deal? This is only understand well before we can see whether this deal would eventually become a deal. As you said, the approval from the legislators coming from 3 countries has to be done next year.
I'm going to jump in because I was former chairman of Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, you know that.
There we go.
The dairy industry.
I lived in Wisconsin.
Very passionate about the dairy industry.
Well, no, I was chairman of the International Trade Council, which dealt with these issues. Actually, the amount of market that's being owned is about $70 million. Now, unfortunately, that's not going to go to farmers, because what has happened is basically fresh milk has a 500-mile radius which you can trade in. And what has happened is the 70 million is going to be in after products. These are products made by large corporations, spray powders, fractionate, things like this, which are going to compete in Canada. Canada has also gotten some givebacks. Now the American dairy market is now open to them, so they have some opportunity to do it. They also got some concessions on wood and also on peanuts. So it's not exactly the one-sided kind of thing that Donald Trump wants you to believe.
Well, even not as one-sided, that's good enough for the other 2 countries, right? You could say this is a relatively fair deal for all the countries involved.
But you have to understand, if you go back and you look at TPP, you'll see that they were going to get, the U.S. would have gotten a better deal under TPP. Remember, a lot of the NAFTA things were put on hold because TPP was going to be the successor to this. NAFTA was going to just melt away because it wasn't relevant.
Okay, Professor Gong, dairy products.
Well, I think for the dairy products, you know, Canadians make some concessions, but as you said, it's a very small amount in the grand scheme of things. It's a few $1 million we're talking about.
Then that's good for the Canadians, one would argue.
It's good for the, I think it's good for some, you know, dairy farmers in the state of Wisconsin, in the state of New York. I think from Canadians' perspective, lumber is a big deal for Canada. You know, Canada and the United States being engaged in this lumber battle for years and decades going back. So now they at least have some period of time that's secured for exports of lumber to the United States, and on that aspect, I think the Canadian definitely gain something. But I think if you look at the overall picture, you know, I think it's an improvement, but I'm just not sure it's a gigantic improvement from America's perspective, as Donald Trump would like to claim. I mean, he like to claim.
Well, I hope you're not standing just on the American perspective, but also looking at the other economies, talking about that. U.S. President Donald Trump is trying to, as the media report suggested, rewriting free trade deals with Mexico, Canada, and the EU, Japan, and South Korea. These deals are expected to have clauses that will forbid similar pacts with China. At next month's China International Import Expo, though, 2,800 companies have signed up, and all G20 members represented, as you can see over there. Having said that, though, what about that clause? the clause in this USMCA that is forbidding the other two economies, certainly very big economies. One is the developed one, Canada, and also dealing largely with China when it comes to trade, and Mexico, a very impressive emerging economy and developing country on its way up. So, Mr. Tangen, when one country is signing a trade deal with the other country, but it is with the condition that the other countries cannot freely deal with economies outside this deal, that sounds very, at least, interesting, Mr. Tangen.
Well, no, Donald Trump is trying to establish an economic hegemony that is based around the United States. He's trying to supplant WTO and all of the different trade pacts and basically say every country is going to deal bilaterally with the United States, and we're going to use our power, political, economic, and military to guarantee that we get the best deal possible.
We also have on the phone right now from Toronto Mr. Laurel Brown, who is a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Professor Brown, what would you make of that deal, the clause that is dealing with Canada and Mexico, forbidding the two countries to deal with China when it comes to more open trade? Why is Canada agreeing to that? Will there be an obstacle or a plus for Canada's economy?
It could be a problem. It's not directed specifically at China, but it is understood that it is more than likely to affect China. Canada was in a very difficult position in international negotiations. Timing is essential, linkages are important, and personalities are crucial. And so we reached an agreement, Canada with the United States and with Mexico, when there was already a bilateral agreement in place between the United States and Mexico. So our choices were narrowed, and we were facing very harsh tariffs from the United States, and I think had we moved earlier, perhaps we would have got a better deal, but it is what it is at the moment, and we have this Article 32, which can present problems for the future, and there are indications that the United States, especially if they reach a deal with the Europeans and with Japan and with Korea, will use this to pressure Beijing.
Right. Well, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Trudeau, of course, was very ambitious at the very beginning and also very firm on principles, as he said many times. Of course, later, eventually, pragmatism overruled everything else, and there is a deal, apparently. But the question is, Canada is running into election season next year. Even the Prime Minister has to think about his own office. So how will this deal, the USMCA, eventually mean for Canada when it comes to political elections, and also whether this deal would actually ever approved by the legislature?
Well, you're absolutely correct. So let me start with the last part, because the deal has to be approved in Congress, and this is not guaranteed. It's likely because there are so many important interests at stake, but it is not inconceivable, depending on what happens in the November elections in the United States, that there may be some difficulties in approving this deal. But if we assume that this deal is approved by the Congress in the United States, in Canada, as you know, we have a prime ministerial system. The government has a majority in Parliament, so there would be no difficulty in having it approved. But when it comes for the next election, then it is both the substance and the perception of the deal. And there may be some issues with substance, because some people will pay a price for that. Dairy farmers, for example, are pretty unhappy. Some of the resource extractors may have difficulty because we still have aluminum and steel as well that are at issue. But if the perception in Canada is, by the time the elections come around, that Canada did not get the best possible deal, there will be undoubtedly a great deal of criticism, and part of it will center on the problem of timing, that Canada waited a bit too long, that we should have moved earlier. We should not have fallen behind and faced a situation where we had Mexico and the United States move ahead bilaterally, and
I see.
we had more limited room for maneuver.
Professor Brown, of course, I understand very well that one would naturally look at its own neighborhood first before looking elsewhere in the world. This also applies to Canada when it comes to reaching this deal, USMCA. However, one has to also point out economies like China and some of the others, which the clause in that deal actually could deal with for the future, are also having very strong trade ties with Canada. For example, Canada will be also very much represented at the incoming Import Expo, the first ever China is holding. Canada is one of those host countries, in fact. So what would this mean for China-Canada trade, both the atmosphere and the content?
It brings a bit more tenuous, but we are very important trading partners. Yes, by far the greatest trading partner for Canada is the United States, but China is an essential trading partner and in many ways a growing trading partner. And Mr. Trudeau has expressed the wish to try to diversify our trade because Canada is so very heavily dependent on trade with the United States. Over 60% of our exports go to United States. We are a G7 country. We are a G20 country. We are an important player internationally. And when it comes to linkages, then there are not just the matters of trade, but also the political factors, the relationship that we have in terms of the international politics of the world, the kind of interest that we may have in various domestic and international issues.
Okay.
We are interested as a country to see a resolution of the problem in North Korea, and China could help.
All right. Professor Laura Brown, thank you so much, coming from Canada, from Toronto. Coming back to our discussion back in the studio, one has to think about this. On the one hand, you see USMCA, has been reached temporarily. We don't know its future, but you also see new ideas coming up and platform being established from the Chinese side as well, coming from the Import Expo. But this is the first ever, Professor Gong. So what is China having in mind? Is China trying to win more hearts and minds from the rest of the world vis-a-vis the United States, or is China having something else in mind?
Well, the Imports Expo was planned a long time ago. It was planned and scheduled way before Donald Trump started the trade war. So I think I want to interpret this expo as a reaction to Donald Trump's trade war. But I think we are very clear about the idea that we have to do something in this area. Our huge trade surplus with the United States in particular is not going to be sustainable in the long run, both politically and economically. So it is something we already planned for. But I think the trade war really highlights the importance of this event. I think it's it could be a very strong signal to the rest of the world that China is committed to further opening up our market, further increasing imports in a very concrete way, actually, to help with alleviating the trade surplus problems with the United States.
When you look at the debate about trade these days, Mr. Tangen, one might want to interestingly see at a critical moment where people would stand. Are they going to stand where the principles are, or are they going to stand where pragmatism is? It is a very interesting time to test that about people's stance. Having said that, though, what does it mean this time, the Import Expo? China is not trying to show, obviously, to any country about so-called attitude, but rather this Import Expo has to benefit China's economy. After all, that's why people are doing things. They're doing things for their own economies and in a bigger context to benefit the rest of the world. So, Mr. Tangen, China has been accused of so many things. It is even hard to explain them one by one in one program. For example, latest about so-called currency manipulator, which is totally out of context. Having said that, though, Mr. Tangen, what do you say this expo, Import Expo, is going to achieve content-wise?
Oh, it's opening up new markets. I mean, it's a very good demonstration of what China has been saying, that there's a win-win out there, that is not a zero-sum game. Donald Trump is zero-sum, playground bully tactics. I'm going to force you into a deal that makes sense for me, even if it doesn't make much sense for you. So you have a very, very stark contrast. And as you said, the question is, where does the rest of the world line up? Is it about pragmatism or about principle? I think with Europe, you're going to see...
And it's a common ground. If there is a common ground between the two of them, that would be even better.
That would be nice, but I don't think there is. I think when you have somebody like Donald Trump who's made it his business to make all sorts of accusations unfounded, and I don't mean just in his regular speech on a daily basis, but against not only China, but almost every country on earth. All right, he has said, they're bad guys, we're good guys, you should do this, you should do that. He has made America victim #1 in the world. Kind of strange for the most powerful military, political, and economic society on
But the
earth.
thing is, Professor Gong, will China be able to stand on a moral high ground? Will that work? I mean, this import expo, it's a wonderful thing because China is restructuring its economy. This is a step in the right direction. But on the other hand, this is also a time to see whether standing on the moral high ground is actually going to be having more peers come along, at least about the principles.
Well, I have to be very candid on this issue.
Right.
I think from a free trade perspective, I still believe that there's still some room for China to improve.
Sure.
I think it's not just about the numbers, the alleviating the trade surpluses with many countries. It's not just about that. I think at the end of the day, there's still a discussion about China as a very unique economic model, having very unique practices, and albeit quite successful so far in terms of developing our economy, in terms of expanding corporate China's footprints around the world. But there's still this debate about whether these practices are up to the I guess the spirit of WTO. And this is one of the major accusations from the U.S. side. And I think these things can be put on the table for negotiation. For things like we have a very large state sector, the SOEs, for example. We have quite extensive state aid programs, and so these things are still quite up to debate. And so I think from the moral high ground perspective, I'm a little bit hesitant to go that far. But I think at least we have the commitment, we have the willingness to at least achieve these goals from a result-oriented perspective. We really want to reduce trade surplus with other countries, no matter how we do it. I think at the end of the day, it's really these numbers are counting.
The numbers are counting. The principles are also very important as well.
I think we need to discuss with our trading partners to make sure that they're comfortable with these two practices. I mean, let me finish. I think, to be honest, it's actually even the European companies, the European side, they still have some, even though they're not. They're against the sort of the tariff practices, the tariff tactics from the United States. But I think from the substance point of view, I think to some degree they're probably in agreement with Donald Trump on some of the issues.
We'll see how things would evolve and whether attitudes are really reflecting the directions of the growth of the world economy. We want to thank both of you for being with us, Zhang Gong and Einar Tangen. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Stay with us here on World Insight, still to come on the program. In tonight's Right in China, hang on to the words of master Chinese poet Xi Chuan. Why is his approach so groundbreaking? That interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Today we bring you the second installment of the Right in China series, one of the series featuring the 40 years anniversary of China's reform and opening up. The interviews with prominent authors will be aired throughout this week. In the 1980s, just as China was beginning to give the world a glimpse of its rich heritage, literature and the arts was blossoming among the younger generation. Many brilliant young poets at the time breathed life into words that moved, inspired, enlightened, and invigorated readers. I spoke with one of China's contemporary poets, Xi Chuan. He shared his unique insight as a wordsmith and how he approaches his and his peers' work with such poetic license. Most notably, he introduced the seminal work of his contemporary Haizi to a much wider audience. Before the exclusive interview, take a look at this.
Some say poetry is either genius or madness. In late 20th century, China has seen several outstanding poets. Their works are immortalized in people's mind and have inspired generations after them. Debasement is the password of the base, nobility the epitaph of the noble. I love not only your statelessness, but also your firm stand, the earth beneath you. Even with these dark eyes, a gift of the dark night, I go to seek the shining light. Among them, Haizi is one of the most beloved poets, who committed suicide at the age of 25. His death is regarded as a turning point in contemporary Chinese literature. As his best friend, poet Xi Chuan has edited the complete poems of Haizi, which includes illustrations drawn by Haizi himself.
Haizi's poem in Chinese. 黑夜从大地上升起，遮住了光明的天空。丰收后荒凉的大地，黑夜从你内部上升。你从远方来，我到远方去，遥远的路程经过这里。黑夜一无所有，为何给我安慰？
Although his poetic oeuvre is relatively small, his archetypal descriptions of the rural and natural world, now virtually extinguished by industrialization, have a lyric intensity that is richly evocative. At that passionate and romantic age, the two poets shared a great time.
Because I know that Haizi is a genius. There's a young artist, young stage director. Every year she directs a play in memory of Haizi. And she always used the word genius. And I told her, for you, genius is a word. For me, that's a person with flesh. I feel that I was lucky to be Haizi's friend and Luo Yihe's friend in 1980s.
You are not just a friend. You were actually the one who worked very hard to push their poetry in front of the public eyes. You were a promoter.
I'm the editor of Haizi's complete poems, the book. That is about 1,100 pages. So that's a thick book, like a dictionary.
What about that complete work of Haizi? When you were editing it?
At that time, I didn't have a laptop or a computer, so I have to copy his poems in handwriting. So usually I worked for 1 week in copying his poems, and then I stopped for 1 week, and then I need a week for my own writing, and then next week should be a week for Haizi. And sometimes I felt that Haizi, he wrote some dreadful poems about ghosts, about bones, about these things. So I remember that one night I had to stop in writing. And I have to stop to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I felt that I should stop in doing this if a ghost will emerge suddenly. But then after 10, nothing happened. So I went on with my work in editing his poems. And that was also a hard time for me. And suddenly I felt that I was alone in this world. And also I was at a loss, not only because of Haizi and Luo Yihe's deaths, but also because of the big change of the Chinese society.
I remember you were talking about yourself and the way you felt about yourself. You said you, quote, became a useless man. That was the time when you lost your two friends.
I don't know. Later I feel that I became a blind person. In 1980s, I felt that I had aims, or one big aim, that is to be a writer, to be a poet, and to know whom you are. But later I lost this aim, so I told others that I became a blind person. I have to confess to myself that I don't know who I am. And I need to understand myself, not only about me, myself, but also about the society, also about the history, also about the life and death.
What about the society? What about the history? What questions you were urgently looking for answers?
About God. Although I'm not a Christian.
Religious?
No, I'm not religious. But let me, take this as an example. Before, I felt that I know the face of God. But later I felt that maybe I need to know something about the back of God. And then I tried to turn to the back of God to see to see it. So
Is the end of naivety?
Yeah, that's a good word. Naivety.
Or the end of the innocence? Those are very...
Oh yes, that's a good word. You know, English poet William Blake, and William Blake said that a person at the beginning of his life, he lived an innocent life, and then he had to get into a step of experience or experiences. So I felt that in 1990s, I stepped onto this step of experience, and he had a poem called Tiger. So tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. But then he had another poem that is Lamb. And so he took lamb and on the one hand, and the other hand is tiger.
And since then, you become a tiger or a lamb? No. I just want to use an analogy, because are you a totally different person since then? You graduated in a way?
I don't know how to put it, but before I understood bright things, luminous things. But
aspirations.
Later, yes. And but later I felt that I need to know something about the evil things and the dark side of life.
Did you have any poems about that?
Oh.
Yourself being, in a way, very observing?
Yeah, later I got an ability, I have to say, I got an ability of understanding absurdities.
Do you like yourself, the one you had back in the 1980s, or you like yourself even better after you see or after you saw the back of the God?
You know, young people, younger than me, they sometimes ask me to tell them some stories about from 1980s. But I always tell them that I'm not a person who's always feel nostalgia for 1980s. I think only those people who had accomplished their jobs. So I think it is their right to think about 1980s again and again. But me, I feel that I'm a person still working. Still walking and working. And so I seldom go back to 1980s. Between poetry and philosophy, or between poetry maybe a religion or something else.
That's very interesting.
It's between us.
Can you give us some examples?
After 1992, I started to write prose poems. And lots of Chinese readers, they were not used to my way of writing after 1992. And they feel that that's not poetry. Because ordinary people, they understand that poetry should be in lines with rhymes.
You want to break that?
Yeah, I want to.
What did you do?
I brought some ideas into poetry writing. I feel that poetry is not poetry. This word is not only for lyrical poetry, because usually people feel that to give ideas, that's a task of philosophers. But I feel that poets also have they need to at least to know something about these philosophical things. I have a series of poems. There's one, the title is What the Eagle Says. I'm trying to talk in a crazy way, I have to say. Oh, I have another series of poems, that is, I try to give definitions to words. For instance, bird. And bird, you have a definition in a dictionary. And I'm trying to give new definitions. I invented. Not only about birds, about city, about this term city, this word, about what else? Fire or shadow. And I try to give the definition in a very official way. But
Xi Chuan way. Xi Chuan's official version.
But what I talk there, what I have there, could be something absurd.
We are very much looking forward to listening to those poems.
Yeah. Grandmother. My grandmother coughs, waking 1,000 roosters. 1,000 roosters crow, waking 10,000 people. 10,000 people walk out of the village. Roosters in the village still crowing. The crowing roosters stop. My grandmother still coughing. My still coughing grandmother mentions her grandmother, her voice getting softer. As if it were my grandmother's voice getting softer. My grandmother talks and talks, then stops, shutting her eyes, as if it were only now that my grandmother's grandmother really died.
What interests you the most these days that you would like eventually put it on paper?
I've just finished a very long essay on Tang poetry. Chinese people, it seems that the Chinese people had a definite way of in reading these poets. So I'm trying to tell something new, to tell something fresh, to give new ways in reading these poets.
But why? I mean, Xi Chuan, why? Chinese society is changing so fast.
Yes.
Why do you have to go back?
Actually, you've given me the answer. That is, the Chinese society changed so rapidly. And then, because of this, right because of this, I am having a way of looking at Tang Dynasty society.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, what's the relationship between poetry writing and the social changes? And you can't read Tang poetry only according to, only as dead poems, only as knowledge. But they are heritages for us. But the poets from Tang Dynasty, when they were writing the poems, they were writing just like us writing at this time. The social changes, gives me such an opportunity to find something new there in Tang poetry.
What did you find?
Because, for instance, in Tang Dynasty, there are also monk poets. And so beside Li Bai and Du Fu, there were poets like Han Shan, who is very famous in other countries, in the United States, in Europe. His name was translated into like this, the Cold Mountain. But in Chinese, that's Han Shan. And, but Han Shan was not the only monk poet from Tang Dynasty. There is another person, his name is Wang Fanzhi, and also a very famous monk of Zen Buddhism, Huineng. They wrote with a kind of vernacular Chinese. They were away from the mainstream of the Tang Dynasty. And that, for me, that's quite interesting.
It's very interesting to talk about you got to know the God at the very beginning when you were very young. And then you got to know, as you see it, the back of the God. And now, it seems that you try to see within yourself.
Yeah, I also want to know my limitations. So my possibilities and also my limitations. I have to say that my brain is crowded with concepts from the Western world. Well, then I traveled to countries like India, like Turkey, like Egypt. Because of my experiences of traveling to these less advanced countries, I feel that maybe the whole issue is not so simple.
Xi Chuan, one of the most well-known contemporary Chinese poets. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.